Welcome to this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar on how to investigate organized crime in Africa. My name is Maxime Kwame-Dominique and I'm GIJN Francophone Africa editor. I will be joined later by my colleague Madeleine Ngeunga, who is the Anglophone Africa GIJN editor for Anglophone Africa. Before we get going, I would like to remind you that this webinar is being broadcasted in two languages, in English and in French. So if you like to listen to this service in English, please go to the bottom right and to the interpretation button and click choose English. So if you want to listen to this webinar in French, do the same in French. I would like to say it quickly in French before we get going. So, donc, si vous nous suivez en français, ou voulez suivre ce webinaire en français, regardez en bas au niveau du bouton d'interprétation, cliquez sur le bouton d'interprétation et choisissez le français. Restez là-bas jusqu'au bout. Merci. Donc, vous avez 2-3 secondes pour le faire. Alors, merci beaucoup. Thank you. Let's get going. Organized crime and corruption are widespread, deeply rooted and growing in Sub-Saharan Africa, a region where we have world highest rate of poverty and inequality. Powerful criminal groups operate with the help of politicians, government officials, and criminal service industry, including corrupt banks. They make their money through illegal drug trade, human trafficking, wildlife smuggling, illegal mining, illicit trade in arms, and more. This has led to huge transfer of wealth, increasing poverty, the rise of extremist groups, the decline of democratic institutions, and strengthening the kleptocratic regimes. In this GIJN webinar, we are pleased to have 3 senior journalists who will be sharing their tips, resources, and experience on how to report on these topics in Africa. Without further delay, let me introduce to you our today's speakers. Madeleine Ngeunga is Cameroonian data journalist specializing in environment and human rights. Currently, Madeleine is a fellow at the Pulitzer Center's Rainforest Investigation Network and editor of InfoCongo. Ngeunga combines fieldwork and satellite data analysis to produce in-depth environmental investigation in the Congo Basin Forest. Welcome. Thank you, Madeleine, for joining us today. We will have today Sandrine Sawadogo, who is reporter with L'Économiste du Faso, a leading economic weekly in Burkina Faso. She specializes in economic and financial reporting, including illicit financial flow, corporate fraud, and ill-gotten wealth. Sawadogo is a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, and has worked on a number of ICIJ investigations, including Panama Papers, fatal extraction, and recently Shadow Diplomat. Thank you, Sandrine, for joining us today. And our third panelist today is Khadija Sharif, who's based in South Africa and is a senior investigative journalist at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP. Khadija has contributed to investigation about illegal logging in Madagascar, corruption in Angola, commodity traders fueling armed trafficking in Cote d'Ivoire. She's a former director of the Platform for Protection of Whistleblowers and 2021 Yale Pointer Fellow in Journalism. For some of you who are new to, thank you, Khadija, for being with us today. For some of you who are new to our webinars, just want to share this with you. Global Investigative Journalism Network, or GIJN, is the largest global network of non-profit investigative journalism organization. We have 225 member organizations in 89 countries, but these figures will be updated very soon since we are having new members. However, we work with journalists everywhere in non-profit, commercial organizations, and with freelancers. We have an extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help journalists worldwide, which you can check on our website, GIJN.org. We also want to hear from you in the audience today, so please send your questions and messages in the Q&A box. Just see at the bottom and you see Q&A box. We'll get to as many as we can. My colleague, Madeleine Ngeunga, will join us a bit later and put those questions to our panelists today. Feel free to start asking the question from now. I must also mention that this webinar is tied to the publication of GIJN Guide on how to investigate organized crime in Sub-Saharan Africa. We published a chapter this week, just yesterday, as many of you have probably seen it, and the full report will be published next year. That said, let's get going. Madeleine, you've been kind enough to accept, to put together the chapter on how to investigate environmental crime on the coming guides. What is it about when we talk about investigate environmental crime in Africa, and how can journalists in the region report on those crimes in this region of Africa?
Thank you very much, Maxime. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be among you today and to speak on this GIJN panel in order to share my experience that I've accumulated along the years investigating environmental crime in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm going to share my screen so we can follow together my presentation. I will address investigating environmental crime in Sub-Saharan Africa and how you can actually investigate. So Sub-Saharan Africa is the region, and I work for Info Congo. I am one of the editors of Info Congo, and we report on the tropical forests in Congo. I'm also part of the Rainforest Investigation Network, where we deal with cross-border issues for all rainforests of the world in Southeastern Asia, Amazonia, and Africa too. So I would like, firstly, to deal with investigating environmental crime in Sub-Saharan Africa. So first and foremost, I'd like to say that these crimes are even more present on the global stage. It's the fourth activity, just after drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. This is why environmental crime is a burning issue for the world and for Africa. It is believed that Africa loses 195 billion linked to environmental crime. So what are the main issues? According to reports that we were able to consult, there's issues with non-regulated fishing, illegal logging, contraband of threatened species, illegal mining exploitation, land grabs for big infrastructure or agro-industrial projects, or water or river pollutions. And this has an impact on a number of populations that depend on these lands to survive. So when you investigate environmental crime for Sub-Saharan Africa, it is crucial to bear in mind these different issues and to look at the interplay between these issues in order to properly identify what is at stake. As for the investigation per se, one of the main approaches that we foster today, and the approach that we implement in our day-to-day practice, is to cross-reference field data and satellite images. I'd say that what's important is that journalists think outside of the box. You have to go further than just asking questions to the general public. We have to be able to leverage all these innovative tools that we have at hand. We have a number of platforms today which allow us to look at the state of forests in our countries and assess how they have been evolving along the years. I will go further into detail to explain this. So these tools, via smartphones or via a regular GPS device, I'm thinking you could integrate a GPS in other applications, such as Ultilop, and you can really install some apps in your smartphones, and you can take a photo of an area and immediately receive the GPS coordinates. Let me address an investigation I was carrying out on illegal logging. So when you go in the field, you can take a photo and immediately recuperate the GPS data. And once you get the GPS data, you are able to realize that this is the zone which is concerned. And we were aware that there had been some illegal logging and communities were living not far from here. And we were also close to a classified area, and partial destruction of this land affected communities because elephants who were in this protected piece of land started roaming free and destroyed some crops. As you can see, there's a number of new tools that allow us to better investigate. And we're able to put together really complex investigations on environmental crimes. And these new tools give us satellite images and allow us to really perceive what has changed on the forest plot. What happened before, what happened after, and how it evolved. There's another thing we recommend when one strives to investigate environmental crime. I'm thinking about an instance pertaining to mining. We believe that collaboration is key to a successful environmental crime investigation. So these are tools that are useful for complex investigations, especially if you're alone investigating on this issue. So we believe that you have to collaborate and you mustn't work alone. You can collaborate with civil society, but also with experts who are carrying out research on these matters. Here you have a drone image, and it wasn't taken by a journalist. It was actually an expert in mining who was able to give us this photograph that showcases the extent of mining in that forest. There are also other tools that allow you to draw comparisons between the state of a forest before and after its exploitation. So you have Global Forest Watch. You can connect to the platform, and I'll show you how it works. And it might be useful for people who seek to carry out investigations on the state of forests in Africa. So you can connect to Global Forest Watch. And let me show you how this works. So this is Global Forest Watch. Once you've connected to the platform, and imagine you want to find out what happened in some regions where you suspect there's illegal logging, you can click on the map tab, or carte in French. So I clicked on the map tab, and then as you can see, a map of the world is displayed, and you can select a country of choice. I've chosen the DRC. As I click, I can zoom in on the map and really select the zone that I wish to analyze. And I click on Analyze, and then I'll display the map of the DRC. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can select a number of data layers which allow you to better understand what is taking place. So there's one data layer which is crucial if you're looking at illegal logging, and that is the data layer evolution of the forests. This data layer allows you to find out which were the most recent warnings that were issued. Imagine that you're looking at a a protected area. This map could show you that some regions in this area are subjected to illegal logging. And thanks to this platform, you can collect this information. As you can see that forest cover has decreased. And so you have warnings pertaining to deforestation. You also have warnings pertaining to the loss of forest cover due to fires. Let me click on integrated warnings on deforestation. As I click on this data layer, well, let me just unselect a few of the items so I can better show you how this works. So now I'm going to go back to a virgin map. So this is the raw map of the DRC with no data displayed. And if you want to display the data which is of interest to you, you can click on evolution of forest and then click on deforestation integrated warning. So then on the map, you'll be able to acknowledge the regions where some issues arose. That allows you to identify illegal logging in some regions. And I invite you to further explore the platform yourself. There's also a handbook that lets journalists better use the platform. Most of open source platforms have handbooks with them, so you can really leverage them to the best of your ability. There's another platform called Protected Planet. It's useful when you work on protected areas. You might not have a map of said areas, but if you connect to this digital tool, you can have an overview of the protected areas across the world. So this is the landing page of the website. When you scroll down, you will display another world map, and the green pixels show where protected areas are. And you can also zoom in on the map and select the protect area that is of interest to you. So let's choose one at random. So this is in Cameroon. It's the Ja area. And this protected area is now displayed. You thus have more information on the protected area. And that can allow you to better understand your future field trip, or to better think about the field trip you just took to the area. And maybe improve the way you have been investigating potential crimes being carried out in the area. Or maybe it could be some management issues with the park, or they might be hosting traffickers. So anyway, these are sources that allow you to have to collect more information on these areas. Often in African states, we complain about the lack of that data, but we have other means that allow us to investigate, and we can collect data via these platforms that are real wealth of map data that allow you to really have a better overview of the situation. You also have other platforms that give information pertaining to environmental crime. I'm thinking about the platform of the African Wildlife Foundation. There's also the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Let me click on the UNODC. There are a number of reports drafted and pertain to Africa. You can look at Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and these websites allow you to collect more information pertaining to specific types of crime in Africa. You have many other types of information in that regard on these platforms. As for tips and tricks, so as you are aware of, investigating environmental crime is often a thorny issue, and you have to map the stakeholders before you really go deep. You have to identify the experts, the civil society, civil servants that might give you information. And one of the main approaches is to really cross-reference the data you have with local communities and the information they can give you, because these communities are often the most impacted by these environmental crimes. So it's important to hear their voice also. And civil servants can potentially get involved too. We realize that, but sometimes in other countries, these civil servants are part of these criminal organizations. So you must be cautious in the way you proceed. And then you also have all the other environmental organizations.
Thank you, merci. Thank you, Madeleine, for this presentation. I have one question before we move on to Sandrine. You mentioned two tools, and we know that in this region of Africa, sometimes newsrooms can have some limited resources. Are those tools free, and how easy are they, for journalists who are not so tech savvy, let's say like that?
Most of the tools, well, are challenging. Yeah, let's say that. It could be difficult indeed to use these tools or to have access to these tools as from African newsroom. But our experience shows that actually most of those tools are open data or open source platforms. So they're free of access, and sometimes they're quite easy to use. Well, when a journalist wants to use such a platform, what we advise them to do is to see a little bit how they work. And there are tutorials as well. There are guides as well for these platforms. Most of these platforms do provide for a guide or a handbook to use the platform. So you've got, for instance, a handbook on how to use the data on the platform, how to navigate on the platform, how it works. So that's how to start, really. You need to train yourself when you indeed want to use the platform. Just read the guides and the handbooks on the website.
Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you for this explanation. As I said, my colleague Benon Oloka is in the background and is collecting your questions. So if you have your questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and then my colleague will collect them and put them to our dear panelists a bit later. Now comes time to give the floor to Sandrine Sawadogo from Burkina Faso. She authored one of the chapter in the Common Guide, a chapter on how to investigate organized crime, financial organized crime and scandals in Africa. She authored this chapter with Will Fijibon from International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, but Sandrine will be representing the DU to then tell us a bit on how to dive into this kind of investigation. Sandrine, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Maxime. Merci.
Hello, everybody. So I have a pleasure indeed to show you the result of a teamwork here. This is something that I wrote with Wilfried Giraud, who's my colleague from the ICIJ. And we talk about financial crime and the related scandals in Africa, as you can see on my screen. So what is financial crime? Because I know that most of you know what it means. But to go back to my presentation, well, it's basically a type of crime related to assets. So we're talking here about money laundering, terrorist financing, fraud, or simple theft or corruption. Now, theft and corruption are also considered as financial crime most of the time. So in here, why should we investigate financial crime? And that's the main question. That's the question, really, that we will try to delve into today. You see this image? Now, this is really a summary of the situation in Africa today. You've got a luxury car, just getting some petrol at a petrol station. And next to that car, you've got a little boy with a canister, just waiting to fill the tank, his canister with fuel. Now, this image really shows the gap, the inequality in Africa. So it's true, financial crime is not something that is just typical of Africa. But in Africa, you've got a series of factors: abundant natural resources, you've got digital services that are underdeveloped, the governing bodies and the politicians are trying to gain more money. And all these factors have been really attracting for decades big multinationals, but also criminals, individual criminals. According to the UN, the situation is quite clear. You have 150% more rich people than poor people. If you want, there is an exponential increase in the number of rich people in Africa. And when we talk about rich people, we're talking about very rich people. And according to the African Development Bank, poverty in Africa is around 34% with peaks in West and Eastern Africa. So all the rich people are not criminals, of course, and they don't have secrets to hide. But when you go and when you look at the journalists' investigations, well, they show those investigations that the richest citizens like Isabel de Santos or the Gupta brothers in South Africa, well, these people have amassed wealth by criminal means in a way. Why investigate financial crime? Well, multinationals that are operating on the continent, they're making even more money, and they have the means that make it harder for governments to actually govern. And according to the IMF, the Sub-Saharan Africa, they lose $730 million per year in fiscal revenue coming from revenue that they could collect from these multinationals. So that's the general framework on financial crime. Let's talk about good practices, tips, and tools. Now in here you see a dog, a sniffer dog. So the first tip I would say is to get better at sniffing crime, if I may. One example. So this is just a first example. You've got a businessman in Malawi. In Malawi, he is the manager of a company in East Africa. Now, if he wants to open a private bank account in the United Arab Emirates or in Switzerland, well, you have to ask yourself, that's not logical. Something is going on. Another example, take a Canadian multinational that's just signed a contract to exploit, for instance, a zinc mine in Senegal. Canada, Senegal, okay, there's a direct link, but why would this multinational go through, for instance, one of its companies in Madagascar to deal with the contract? Why? These are leads that can indeed allow you to find some sort of financial crime being committed. Now you have to identify the catalyzer. For instance, if you create, let's say, a front company in a tax haven, you open a bank account to launder money, or you receive tax advice to hide illicit gains. At each step, a businessman will need a facilitator. It can be a lawyer, an accountant, a consultant, a PR professional, etc. So it's very important to identify these facilitators, these catalyzers, if you will, those frontmen around your main area of interest. That's the first thing. The second step will be to indeed ask questions to this person. We have a very specific case that we try to illustrate in the guide that the GIJN is going to publish. It's the case of a musician who's managing an arms sale company. During an investigation on arms transactions between Burkina Faso and Serbia, well, we found a musician who was, so to speak, a manager of an arms sale company. Now, this is, of course, just a fake company. It was just a screen company. And indeed, well, we were able to discover that this musician was just a nominee. Now, when you deal with this kind of cases, well, you have to indeed take into account that, for instance, if you have a contract, a bank account, they're not going to be under the name of the person, of course, that you are going to investigate. They will use the name of their children, their secretary, their chauffeur, their wives, an employee, but they'll never put their own name. Third tip, read and read. You see the screen? Read the footnote. This is the structure of a parent company with, of course, all the related companies. And you'll be very, very often confronted with this kind of documents when you investigate financial crime. Now, of course, the economic information is sometimes quite complex to read, a little bit like what you see on the screen, especially when you see, for instance, the annual statement of a company. But don't let that deter you from investigating. You'll see the parent company, subsidiaries, etc. But if you have, for instance, a yearly report of a company, don't just dwell on the pictures or on the long list of partners or subsidiaries. No, read the footnote first and foremost, and keep in mind that the most useful parts of such a document are at the level of the annexes towards the end of those documents and those reports. Look for some keywords. For instance, liabilities, possible liability, etc., etc. In the annexes or with these keywords, you will find, if you find, for instance, a company that is, of course, for instance, where you have stocks that's in the stock exchange, well, that company will have to publish things like, for instance, if there are investigations going on, if there are, for instance, disputes, ongoing litigation. Those are signs, those are leads that will help you in your investigation. But you'll ask me, well, where can we find these annual reports? It's true that the data related to financial crime is not very widespread, but in the GIJN guide with my colleague, we tried to come up with a list of tools that you can use. Now, this is not a very long list, but it's a good starting point. You can also, for instance, look at the judiciary proceedings, for instance. There are, of course, the websites of the tribunals and the courts on cases in Africa, but the courts themselves are outside of Africa. For instance, the courts in Australia and in Canada. If you're investigating, for instance, cases related to mining, this is a very good tip, Australia and Canada. Also, the RIS website, well, you will find most of the companies that are present in Mauritius. Now, you know that Mauritius used to be a tax haven. For about a year now, it has ceased to be, or is no longer on the CBRIS list. And then you've got the websites, the reference websites, for instance, the ICIJ's offshore leaks database, the OCCRP's databases. And there's also this website for the French-speaking journalists. And here you've got all the assets that are registered in France for companies. And you've got, of course, all the databases that you will be able, of course, to look at. They will all be quoted in the guide of the GIJN. Now, to illustrate what we've done with all these tips, well, we've decided to present you with a case study, what we call the Gupta leaks. The Gupta's leaks. Have you heard of it? It's an investigation that goes back to 2017 with two reporters that were all South African. And during their investigations, it was made clear that the three Gupta brothers, who are indeed friends of the then South African president, well, these three brothers had reclaimed, between inverted commas, political decision-making in that country. So thanks to the investigation, it was shown that those three brothers indeed benefited from government contracts and allegedly laundered billions of rands. We're talking here about hundreds of millions of dollars or euros abroad. And it revealed also that the role of multinational companies that those brothers used in order to facilitate their alleged wrongdoings. Now, this is a good example because it really shows the power of cooperation between journalists of two newspapers within the same country. And in the guide, you've got all the other case studies that we thought were very useful, so that you understand a little better what we call financial crime. Maxime, I think I was a little bit shorter than Madeleine. Thank you very much for your attention at any rate. And I hope those tips were useful for you to investigate on financial crime. And of course, go back to the website of the GIJN and to consult the guide. So I hope now you have an interest in discovering what financial crime is.
Thank you, merci. Thank you, Sandrine, for this brilliant presentation. And after Madeleine, you also stressed on how collaboration is, let's say, critical, you know, for journalists willing to investigate crime and yeah, in Africa. Now, tell me, like, you have a journalist from a newsroom, let's say from one country from Africa, willing to investigate, you know, on a company, but as you said, it's sometimes can be complicated, can be complex, you know, the structure of those corporates, for instance. How can that journalist start, you know, his or her investigation? How can she or he start collaboration or building a collaboration around his project, his investigative project?
Thank you for your question, Maxime. Straight to the point. I believe that if a journalist wants to investigate a company, he must first and foremost make sure he has the exact name of the incorporated company when it was created. And when he has the name, he can look for the real owner of the company. Well, that might differ from country to country in Western Africa, but I know that in Burkina Faso, this is a process that you can launch. I know that in Burkina Faso, you have to pay. You have to request the name of the owner by submitting the full name of the company, a specific reference number, and then you can get the exact name of the beneficial owner. So if this beneficial owner is a foreign individual, well, he could contact that country and say, well, I'm working on this company, and I know this individual is a person of interest for me. Could you maybe put me in touch with a journalist that is working?
Just to remind that ICIJ is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and SINOZO is a platform like Nobel Zongo Cell for Investigative Journalism that covers the whole West Africa. West African investigative journalists. Those are some great platforms, and yeah, we can maybe cite other platform like OCCRP, and that's gave me the opportunity. Thank you, Sandrine, that gives me the opportunity to now bring in Hadija Sharif, who I say is a senior investigative journalist at the OCCRP, and Hadija Sharif will take us through how to investigate kleptocracy in Africa. Hadija, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I've just turned my camera off for a bit to avoid a bad internet connection. I appreciate the time today. I'll be going into a little bit of stagecraft in terms of how to investigate kleptocracy and organized crime very quickly. Like many of you, I'm come from a difficult place, you know, apartheid South Africa, and the law was inhuman. So to report the truth, you had to, as a journalist, they had to essentially break the law. So it's a twist on the idea that people have to break the law to commit a wrong, because often we think of laws as intrinsically true and morally right, even if it falls short. But the essence of the corrupted state, where representatives are often partners in crime with cartels, is one of a very selective democracy. So whether it's an authoritarian state or a dominant one-party state, as we have in South Africa and Namibia and Botswana, essentially the criminal rents the privileges of the sovereign state, and those who have taken the political agency of the people hijack that fiscal social contract for their personal gain. And the third component of this, between the criminality and the political predation that outsources the sovereignty of the state, is the offshoring. Because the gain that they have for their role as a doorman to let the bad guys in is often offshore. It's sent away to places where they want to live in luxury, that are secretive and politically stable for the cash that they want to hide, but which also has a strong legal infrastructure that confers upon them the privileges to protect what they have stolen. So this is in contrast, I think, to the popular belief that it's the small island secrecy jurisdictions like the Seychelles and the Mauritius and the Macaus that are actually the problem. Because these are conduits, these are pass-through places where the money flows en route to the stable jurisdictions, whether it's the United States or Switzerland. Because these banks cannot be guaranteed the capitalization by the states. The states do not have the GDP to guarantee it. So we have to look at the components and the characteristics of every part of that financial infrastructure to understand where it's coming from, where it's going, and why. So as journalists, we start from the idea of right and wrong, the case study of what is going wrong, what harms the public good and society, rather than what is legal and illegal. Because if something is illegal here, by outsourcing it, they can make it legal there. And the good thing is that whereas law enforcement has a national ceiling, they cannot breach that ceiling. They have to apply for assistance from another jurisdiction. As journalists, we can move very swiftly across borders, almost like the criminals. We can collaborate and get evidence and help. And that evidence doesn't have to be held to the level of hygiene that the court would hold it, fruits from the poisonous tree, if it isn't obtained in the right way. And the other upside to us is that human behavior is inherently predictable. So even where criminals or corrupt politicians will try to hide the pattern of performativity in the past, or they may try to disrupt it or create a new pattern, inevitably, because they are humans, because behavioral finance is led by human behavior, they will create a new pattern. And what we have to do is master the system and master the psychology of the people involved so that we can anticipate how they are behaving and how they will behave. And we know that every story we report on has a real world effect on societies, from the forest to the hospitals. Nothing that they take is for free. Someone somewhere is always paying the price. So whether we are investigating financial crime by the kleptocratic state or an organized crime cartel, the first thing they will do is raid and ruin the ecology, whether it's polluting a river or stripping a mine. They'll target the low-hanging fruit, the public contracts, which they will inflate the cost of or deliver a bad deal for. And this capital is often intertwined, as we know, with the conditions of the regimes, how the regimes keep those societies. So the corrupt state, the oil-rich country is often heavily militarized. They need weapons. The sovereign control may be obtained through election rigging. Bribery will be framed as a service provider fee. So it's always good to look at how the system that sustains this corruption is involved. You have to look at the components of the system that then enables the crime. So just going to Jammeh, the previous slide, we saw that he was literally eating his country like a piece of bacon. We can see that for decades, he ate his country alive with the appetite of a villainous, cartoonish character. And on the surface, it looked like he was running a tin pot regime, but that simply wasn't true. While he did Machiavellian things and, you know, he butchered people, he beheaded them, he brought down Michael Jackson's brother, who was a very bad entertainer, and paid him a lot of money. So he committed all of these crimes, you know, but the financial infrastructure of the dictator's anatomy is in fact very sophisticated. They repurpose state institutions to launder money coming into the country from Hezbollah, a US sanctioned militant group, which tells us that small economies can be laundering hubs for money coming in as well as money going out. They gave these sanctioned group monopolies over the telecoms, over fuel, which Total, French company Total, supplied to Hezbollah, who then supplied it to the Gambia. So it kind of allowed for all of these basic services, from using the telephone or internet to buying diesel. All of these services were jacked, which then made criminals even more money that they were laundering and allowed for them to buy into state institutions. And of course, they hijacked major infrastructure like the central bank, where they created new accounts at the central bank. They hijacked dormant account, and they used mixed use accounts. And finally, of course, there's the usual donor money through checkbook diplomacy. And they used this for weapons in Casamance, neighboring Senegal. They also used it as far as Sudan. So they were facilitating conflict through the use of donor money. And it was kept in more than a dozen Western banks, which allowed free use of these accounts. So a small country like the Gambia that is seen to have no real substantive impact on the world, in fact, impacted half a dozen African countries, ruined the rainforest of a neighboring country, facilitated conflict there, misused donor money. And in the limited time that we focused on the story, we could see almost $1 billion had been taken in this way. So, for example, just Rosewood, more than $275 million in a short period of years from the neighboring, from the forest between Senegal and Gambia. So in trying to understand how to investigate kleptocracy or organized crime, very often the nexus between the two, you look at the stagecraft, you pull back the curtain and you try to understand what is the purpose of the companies, because they all had companies, legal vehicles, often very containerized, like special purpose vehicles, to host their business interest, to send large fake loans to themselves, to receive profits.
Khadija,
so what is the purpose?
Sorry. Is it on purpose that the presentation is not progressing?
Oh, it is not on purpose. I'm on the slide financial stagecraft. Are you able to see that?
Yes. Okay, that's fine.
Okay. And I'll move through very quickly. Sorry for this. So we're looking at what is the purpose of the company? Where does it operate, in which countries? So you're looking to the substance of the jurisdictions. What are the names of the linked companies? What is the logic of the company? For example, if it's sending or receiving a lot of loans, you try to understand the purpose behind it to see whether it's a false financial transaction, looking at where taxes are paid, profits and losses recorded, what type of assets it holds, and what is the financial infrastructure. And by going through that financial stagecraft and matching it to information that's in the public domain, whether it's corporate data, court records, satellite imaging, for example, we relied on the FBI's disclosure of companies, it's very possible to see what is actually happening. As you investigate your story, your investigation, you look for prosecutorial investigative systems to try and isolate contradictions, inconsistency, bias. And this will help you go through your story as a lawyer would go through his story, his witness, his evidence in court when building a case. The conflict, of course, when trying to obtain information from law enforcement, they'll often come to you, is that everyone has a different mandate and a journalist must keep the story until publication. But law enforcement doesn't necessarily want you to publish, because once it's published, the flee clauses are triggered and the whole system changes. So while you try to collaborate with law enforcement, make sure that you are receiving information more than giving it, because everyone has a different risk and threat model. So for example, when we were trying to identify gold that was illegally moving from Sudan, we used free satellite imaging techniques, as a former speaker mentioned. The same thing happened with the transshipment of illegal logging in Liberia. Import-export data is a really big one, because even if they conceal the substance of what they are exporting or importing, you can still see who is the consignor, the consignee, where it's coming from, where it's going to. So in this case, Russia's Space and Rocket Corporation was exporting a ton of goods to Angola, but they labeled it as furniture, plastic spoons, laminated desks, and so forth. So it's really easy to identify the contradictions, the inconsistencies in the evidence that is on hand, even if they are trying to hide it. And it's important for us to do this before the money is stolen, because less than 5% of stolen money can ever be recovered, even if the state wins a case and tries to hire a firm to find that money. The banks that are involved will keep that money, it buffs up their liquidity, they will hold it in nominee accounts, and nobody can ever find it again. So as you are investigating, whether it's a vessel or an oil rig in Nigeria, for example, we went through all of the oil rigs in the offshore or the deep water state that brings in tens of billions of dollars to Nigeria. And we were able to see over 90% of the ships were registered in jurisdictions or tax havens where no oil activity occurred. So the Bahamas, St. Vincent and Grenadines, the Marshall Islands, even Liberia, which barely had a port. And that allows for them to pay no royalties on the oil, no environmental laws are implemented, no labor laws. And in the event that a major oil spill occurs, these jurisdictions, these vessels, for example, BP in the Gulf of Mexico, they leased a vessel from a company called Transocean. That company gave the biggest bonus during the Gulf of Mexico spill, because their executives prevented them from being litigated against by way of putting that rig, registering that rig in the Marshall Islands in Panama. So always look for where the rig is registered, where the companies are registered, and try to see what limited liability those jurisdictions offer. The government of Nigeria cannot regulate what is not within its jurisdiction to regulate. Another way of tracking is using systems like flight radar. For example, if you're trying to see if a certain plane, private or commercial, is in operation, who owns it, what fleet does it belong to, where is it moving, you could go to some of these free databases. It's something that law enforcement uses as well. So for example, when this plane belonging to Obiang was flying into the Netherlands, they were able to track it through live air radar tracking and actually seize it when it arrived. In the same way, when you're trying to understand how a mineral commodity, for example, gold, passes through the world, look for the conduit jurisdictions. The Dodd-Frank Act, for example, did not take into account where gold was being refined. It only looked at the provenance or the origin of gold. And this $2.5 billion worth of gold actually propped up the Sudanese dictatorship for many, many years, passed through Dubai, went to Switzerland, where it was sold to companies like Apple. So always look for the different points in the supply chain to understand who or how the system is being hidden. Finally, obtaining data.
Yes. Hadija, sorry, we're still on the financial statecraft, the first slide. Is it okay?
Oh my gosh, we should be right at the end, almost at the end where it says OCCRP member network. I'm so sorry, guys. We can email. We can email the slide over. If you could just, okay, I don't think you have control of this. But anyway, I'm on the slide that says dig for the facts. If people go to Investigative,
you can just move to that slide and then we take it from there.
Can you see that slide?
No, we are saying the first, we're still saying the first slide.
That is a tragedy. I'm so sorry about that.
No.
Okay, well, I'm basically at the end of the talk. We'll send the slides around. But if people go to investigative-dashboard.org, you can file a research request. You can ask for anything from corporate beneficial ownership data to satellite imaging. There are researchers from all around the world who are also very skilled investigative journalists, and they will be able to help you on cross-border investigations, help you deepen the story that you are looking at, make the angle more surgical, and basically help the story be more effective as a criminal docket. I'll stop there, but I'm so terribly sorry that the slides didn't work. And we'll
thank you, thank you, Khadija, for this brilliant presentation. And we will. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be online. And then we'll probably have also we are there at the GIJN. If you like some more resources, tips from the panelists, we can just forward your question to them after this webinar. Just get in touch with us. So before I give the floor to my colleague Benon Oluka, who will be who is collecting the question in the Q&A box. How do you have this question? How to recognize a kleptocratic regime?
That's a good question. It can be an authoritarian regime. It can be a government that has a dominant political party. But the essential characteristics of a kleptocratic regime is to understand who that regime serves. The fiscal social contract between citizens and the state means that the bulk of income from the state must at least come from public resources and or citizen-generated taxes. Where citizen-generated taxes are low in a state, you see the citizens are marginalized, their economies, their well-being, the resources needed to keep a domestic economy alive is pushed to the side, and the source of income is coming from a shareholder, not a stakeholder. Is it a shareholder like an oil company? Is it a shareholder like a cartel? So understand where the money is coming in, look at the militarism of the state, look at the way in which the state handles judicial and political issues, and don't be fooled by whether there is the veneer of electoral democracy or not. The state that steals can come in many, many forms.
Thank you, Khadija, for this explanation. So now comes the time to give the floor to my colleague Benon, who now come from the background and the front.
Okay. Thank you, Max. Hello, everyone, and thank you for sending your questions for our speakers today. In the interest of time, I will dive right into the questions right away. The first one is from Cabral Dorian, who has a question for Madeleine. Cabron says, are there platforms that provide knowledge of timber exports at the level of African countries?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Benon, and thank you for the question. Yes, there are platforms. You can't find them systematically for every country, though. There is a platform. Now, this is not just on African countries, but you've got the UN country database where you can find data on, for instance, imports and exports for several types of resources and products in the world. Now, specifically, if, for instance, in the UN Comtrade database, you can't find what you're looking for the different countries. In the case of Cameroon, well, you can go to the source. You've got the Forest Ministry, for instance, in Cameroon, and there is a statistical division working in cooperation with, in close cooperation with the port, with the customs officers as well. And so they've got statistics on the exports, for instance, of timber from one country to another. So of course, the approach can be different from one country to another, but governments will also have, for instance, statistics on the exports and imports of timber in every country. So perhaps look at the level of the country, perhaps look at the different departments that are in charge of collecting exports and imports data. Perhaps they put those data online. If not, we'll try to have contact with, to come into contact with people working in those departments to get the data. And of course, there are international platforms such as the UN Comtrade portal. And again, you will have access to the export numbers for the different countries. That would be my advice, my tip.
Okay, great. Thank you. There is a second question here. I think anyone can take it. It's from Christine Rowe, who asks, are you able to speak with perpetrators of environmental crimes? If so, How do you find them and approach them?
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, thank you very much to Christine Rowe for asking this question. Okay, that's really the basis when you're investigating. You need to, of course, reveal something at the end of your investigation. And the best way to do so is to approach, of course, the perpetrators and to really ask some question candidly. So yes, in some cases, we can have a discussion, we can interview those perpetrators. It's not something that's systematic. Of course, sometimes the perpetrators refuse to talk to us. Sometimes you need to go through a lawyer, for instance, but it's a basic rule for those who are doing investigative journalism. You need to talk to the perpetrators, listen to what they have to say, and publish what they say. Indeed, if there's a judicial proceeding afterwards, so well, it's much easier. So there are techniques to find them as well. It's not that difficult. Of course, you don't knock on the door and say, listen, I have a question. Did you commit a crime or not? No, of course not. You need to be a little more subtle. And of course, you need to know how to approach people. If you go candidly and you say, hello, my name is Sandrine Sawadago, and I'm a journalist and I want to ask a question, that's not going to work. In West Africa, at least my experience of approaching this kind of criminals. Now, we're talking here of white collars. To be honest, they prefer, those white-collar criminals, they prefer to talk to external people, come from abroad, rather than talking with the locals. So sometimes you can resort to a colleague, abroad, and then they can take an appointment, and then it's easier to approach them. I hope I answer the question of Christine's, at least. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you, Sandrine. I think you've answered the question. So we'll go to the next one. This one is tailor-made for Khadija. It's from Vinicius Assis, a Brazilian journalist covering African countries. He says, I am looking for tips, tools, contacts to help me on international drug trafficking investigations, especially between South American and African countries. Where do I go looking? Khadija?
Yes, that's a really good question. We're currently doing a story involving a West African country and a drug cartel, and it's a very sensitive and dangerous business. So the first thing you have to do is cultivate sources, people who formerly worked with the regime, for example, former Attorney General, lower level people working in these systems, contacts with the customs, anyone who is part of that supply chain. How does it come in? Who's involved in the shipping? Who's involved in the corporate structure? So it takes a lot of human resourcing, and part of cultivating sources. Many times people who are criminals, when you extend empathy to them and they feel that you see them and that you hear them and you're not villainizing them, they will help you with information and ways forward. But if he wants to contact me later on my email, I can share some of the more specific things that we do. An easy way, of course, is to go to the Investigative dashboard, which has more than 1 billion leaks, and to use the names and the leads that you have to check everything across the leaks and across the databases, because the chances are, if they're doing it in one country, then a pattern exists in another country, and you can build the bigger picture for that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Khadija. Our next question is about kleptocracy. It says, Sandrine spoke about the case of the Guptas in South Africa, and part of Khadija's presentation focused on this as well. But do the three of you think more investigation by journalists needs to be focused on the area of collusion between government and criminals? And if you're looking at that area of collusion, where do you look to for some of these investigations?
If I can answer, in South Africa, the primary way in, since September 2012, the Guptas were merely fixers. They were not people who had any significant influence or power. They managed to get a lower level politician in their pocket and work their way up, extending jets and payments to people who were in debt. So they looked at people's credit records who had higher senior positions, and they caught those people. And so a way in is obviously to look at the public contracts. The public contracts are the low-hanging fruit. These guys come on board as minority partners, and they are paid kickbacks in the form of service fees for introducing people to each other. So they were effectively doormen. As their politician began to rise, they began to rise. And internally, there was a clash within the different factions of the ANC. So this is the role that political fixers play. They introduce a company to a politician. That politician gets a better deal. And sometimes it can be wholly legal. For example, in the Gambia, the new president, where sedition laws are still trapping journalists, the new president tried to push through a 100-page document in 72 hours for parliament to sign that allows for a complete blanket exemption on any public tender, from computers to fuel and weapons. So it can be completely legal. You have to look at the tender laws of the country and see who is attached to who to kind of unravel the anatomy of that system. And if anyone is interested in investigating the various different Gupta leaks that are involved, that's also hosted on the ID system, and we can give people access to that, or even just to search the database to see how these contracts and deals were structured. Some of them very sophisticated, like hedging interest rates and so on.
Okay, thank you. The next one could be taken by any one of you. It's a question related to how potentially dangerous the work that you're doing is. So how do you all ensure your own safety and the safety of your sources in the process of doing your investigations, during the story production process, and more crucially, beyond when the story is out? Because sometimes we tend to relax when the story is out and think that, you know, after the story is out, a week or a month after that, our sources are safe after that. But there are people who will, you know, as these networks are quite sophisticated, they could wait it out and try to harm these sources a lot much farther than after the story has come out. So how do you all ensure your own safety and safety of the sources during that time?
If I may, Benon, I'm going to talk of what I do. Excellent question, because this is something I had to deal with last year when I published my last investigation last year on this musician that was also the manager of an arms sales company. For me, you know, the investigation was over, the article had been published, the social network had related. So for me, as far as I was concerned, there was no longer any danger. But a week after, well, we actually saw that indeed our article on our website a week later was just pirated and it was just deleted. We republished it and then it was again taken down and again and again. So you see, it was even difficult to make sure that that article remained online. So I had to call on partner media, on partner social networks as well. So it's very important to have networks. And indeed, I resorted to a cell of investigative journalists in West Africa, and they published my article on their website. Indeed, if you go to our website, L'Économiste de Faso, you will not find a trace of that article, because every time we try to publish it, it's taken down. So our website is being hacked. So just to show you that the work doesn't stop after you publish the article, there is a work to be done afterwards, in the aftermath. And as regards the protection of our sources, well, what I can say is that now there are training sessions, courses, apps as well that are available, but also you have to cultivate trust with your source. You have to have a trusted relationship with your source. So the source has to know that you will never betray them in a way. So you really need to build that trust relationship with your partners, with your sources. I don't know if Khadija or Madeleine have something to add, but I'll stop there.
I think, Sandrine, that's excellent and true. And actually in the audience, there's a lot of very senior investigators, Fiona McLeod from Oxpeckers, Luis Nachoti from Mozambique. And these are the guys who are in the field and regularly experience this kind of threat. But For example, if you come to a place like OCCRP, your security will be factored in as the story is being pitched, if you need to be relocated after the story is published, if your whistleblower needs legal advice, if your media will need a defense fund in the case of publication, all of these things need to be factored in properly as the story begins, because if you wait until the end of it, your source may be disappeared, you may be arrested, and you simply will not have anticipated the outcome. So protection of the journalist, the whistleblower, the source, and the story, which means also protecting your data, the way that you manage your data in terms of your behavior, who has access to the same data that you have access, whether even the metadata is scraped off documents before it is published or circulated or given to a lawyer. So there's multiple different components involved, and human behavior, how we approach our interaction with each other and with the data, will eliminate about 80% of the threat. But in many cases, the local journalist is the one in danger when the story comes out. So if you are going to be publishing a very sensitive or dangerous story, try to have a foreign partner that will handle the legal liability, take care of you if you are in prison or rounded up, help relocate you if you might be taken after the story is published. Even where OCCRP's partners in the country are not involved in the story, they may be targeted if a story involving that issue or country comes out. So we also try to keep them informed and relocate them, sometimes not so successfully, but it's a pretty substantive process that should be as detailed as the investigation itself, because when people die, there's no coming back from it.
Okay, thank you, Hadija. Madeleine, very quickly, if you could share your insight.
I think Madeleine is having internet issues, so she's out now, struggling to come back.
Yeah, that's all right. Just to supplement to that, today I received a tool from Code for Africa that seeks to protect women journalists from online harassment. So I'm just sharing it in the chat box. If you can take a look at it, I think it's a quite useful tool that we add to those that already exist. There is a question from Louis, who says, what are the recommended apps to download a part of GPS? I'll share with you, Louis, a GIJN article that has some of those tools in the chat box. Please take a look at that. And then we're running out of time, so I'm trying to rush things a bit. Finally, there is a question for you, Khadija. Somebody says they always ask themselves why OCCRP doesn't have any reports from Sudan, and yet the Sudan has a lot of financial crime and human trafficking cases.
Yep.
You shared.
That's a good question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, it was one of the slides that we were looking at, and actually we just published a story on Sudan a month ago, which was one of the fewest stories to use documentary evidence in the discussion of this particular case involving the regime and Wagner. You see that Dubai is importing $9.5 billion worth of gold from Sudan, and Sudan is only reporting $2.1 billion. A particular company controlled by the Ministry of Intelligence was the facilitator and imported weapons for this group with the exchange of gold. So we are publishing stories on Sudan. Our next one should be out in February. If you covered this subject, please do contact me. It took us a long time because we had to find the right partners that we could protect. So we had to get a security system in place as we publish these types of stories.
Okay, thank you. I have just shared that question, that story that you mentioned with everyone in the chat box. So again, take a look at that. Max, that's all from this side. We have exhausted all the questions. Thank you everyone for sending your questions. If I haven't asked any, please reach out privately. We will try to get answers for you. So Max, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Benon, for coming in and putting all those questions. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Before we close, I would like to thank our GIJN team in the backgrounds, and you, our audience today. Thank you. And thank also to a special thank to the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime for its support to these projects. And especially a very big thank to our guest speakers today, you, Madeleine. Madeleine, I think she's out now, but Sandrine, Hadija, and yeah, obviously Madeleine, who was with us today. Finally, be sure to watch GIJN's Twitter feed in Africa, GIJN Africa and GIJN Afrique in French, and our website, GIJN.org, for details on future events. Once again, thank you all and goodbye.